The telephone rang at Bumpy Johnson's residence on West 139th Street at 23 minutes past 7 on the evening of Thursday, March 18, 1965. Jonson answered on the second ring, expecting a routine business call from one of his associates. Instead, he heard breathing, heavy and deliberate, followed by a male voice he did not recognize speaking words that would trigger a chain of events culminating in one of the most shocking displays of power and strategic thinking that New York's criminal underworld had ever witnessed. The voice said, "We have your daughter. She is alive and unharmed. If you want her to remain that way, you will follow our instructions exactly. Do not contact police. Do not attempt to find us. Wait for our next call." The line went dead. Jonson stood holding the telephone receiver for several seconds, his expression unchanged, his breathing steady, giving no outward indication of the rage and fear that simultaneously flooded through him. William Hewlett, Johnson's bodyguard and closest associate, was present in the room and later described those first moments after the call. Bumpy's face didn't move, Hewlett recalled in testimony given to investigators years later. Most men receiving that kind of call would panic, would start shouting, would immediately start making calls trying to organize a response. Bumpy just stood there holding that telephone, completely still, thinking. After maybe 30 seconds, he hung up the phone, turned to me, and said in a voice so calm it was terrifying, "Call Theodore Green, call Raymond Byrd, call everyone on the emergency list. Tell them to be here in 1 hour. Tell no one why." And then he walked to his desk and sat down and started writing notes on a pad of paper like he was planning a business transaction, instead of responding to his daughter being kidnapped. Ruth Johnson, called Ruthie by family and friends, was 29 years old in March 1965. She lived in her own apartment on 126th Street, working as a secretary at a Harlem community organization, while also helping manage certain legitimate business interests that her father maintained as cover for his criminal operations. She was not involved in the criminal side of her father's activities. Jonson had been adamant throughout her life that she would receive education, would work in legitimate employment, would not be tainted by association with the policy operations and other illegal enterprises that generated his wealth. Ruthie had last been seen leaving her office at approximately 5:30 that Thursday evening. She typically walked the 6 blocks from her office to her apartment, a route she had traveled hundreds of times without incident through a neighborhood where everyone knew who she was, and where her father's reputation provided absolute protection from the kind of street crime that affected other residents. Somewhere during that 6-block walk, between her office and her apartment, Ruthie had been taken. The kidnapping had been executed with sufficient skill and speed that no witnesses had observed the abduction, despite the fact that 126th Street was busy at that hour, with people walking home from work, children playing, merchants closing their shops. The kidnappers had somehow managed to grab Johnson's daughter off a crowded Harlem street in broad evening light, without anyone seeing anything suspicious enough to report or remember. By 8:15 that Thursday evening, Jonson had assembled 14 people in his office above the Palm Cafe on 125th Street. The group included Theodore Green, his attorney, William Hewlett and 3 other bodyguards who served as Johnson's primary security team, Raymond Byrd, who managed Johnson's financial operations, Marcus Williams, who supervised the policy banks and numbers operations, Reverend James Mitchell from Abyssinian Baptist Church, one of Harlem's most influential legitimate leaders who maintained close relationship with Jonson, despite his criminal activities, 2 detectives from the New York Police Department who were on Johnson's payroll and who could provide information about any official investigation if police became involved, 3 other criminal operators who controlled significant territories in Harlem and who could mobilize hundreds of men if necessary, and Dr. Samuel Washington, a Harlem physician who had treated Johnson's family for years and who could provide medical care if needed without involving hospitals that would be required to report gunshot wounds or other injuries suggesting criminal activity. Jonson spoke for approximately 10 minutes, explaining the situation with the same calm precision he used for routine business discussions. He described the phone call, the kidnapper's voice and exact words, the fact that Ruthie had been missing since approximately 5:30, and the instruction not to contact police or attempt to find the kidnappers. Then Jonson laid out his response plan with a level of detail and strategic sophistication that everyone present would later describe as remarkable given the circumstances. First, Jonson stated, "We will not contact police officially, but the two detectives present would immediately begin investigating through unofficial channels to determine if any known criminal groups in New York were involved in kidnappings or had recently been discussing targeting Jonson's family. Second, every person in Harlem who might have witnessed anything unusual on 126th Street between 5:30 and 6 o'clock Thursday evening would be interviewed within the next 12 hours. Jonson's organization had sufficient personnel and community connections to canvass every building, every store, every person who might have been in that area during the relevant time period. Third, Jonson's intelligence network throughout New York's criminal underworld would be activated immediately to determine if any organization outside Harlem had been planning operations against Jonson or his family. This network included informants in Italian organized crime families, Irish gangs, Puerto Rican organizations, Chinese criminal enterprises, and various independent operators who might have information about kidnapping plots. Fourth, financial arrangements would be prepared. Jonson assumed the kidnappers would demand ransom, likely a substantial amount given his known wealth. He authorized Raymond Byrd to assemble $500,000 in cash, which could be increased if necessary, and to have the money ready for delivery within 24 hours. Fifth, and this was the element that would prove most significant, Jonson established a communication protocol. When the kidnappers called again with their demands, Jonson would negotiate for time, for proof that Ruthie was alive and unharmed, and for specific delivery instructions. But he would not simply pay the ransom and hope the kidnappers honored their agreement to release Ruthie safely. The plan Jonson outlined that Thursday evening was more complex and more dangerous than simple ransom payment. Jonson explained that kidnappers who targeted family members of powerful criminals rarely intended to release their victims alive regardless of whether ransom was paid. The victim had seen the kidnappers, could potentially identify them, represented ongoing danger to the kidnappers even after ransom was received. The standard practice in such situations was for kidnappers to take the ransom money and then kill the victim to eliminate the witness, and to avoid the inevitable retaliation that would follow if the victim was released and could provide information leading to the kidnapper's identification. Jonson stated that he would pay whatever ransom was demanded, but simultaneously his organization would conduct an independent investigation to identify and locate the kidnappers before the ransom exchange occurred. Once the kidnappers were identified and located, Jonson would have options beyond simply paying money and hopping for Ruthie's safe return. He could attempt a rescue operation. He could apply pressure to force the kidnappers to release Ruthie without payment. He could eliminate the kidnappers if that became necessary to ensure Ruthie's safety. The goal was not merely to get Ruthie back, but to ensure she came back alive, and to ensure the kidnappers faced consequences that would deter anyone else from considering similar actions against Jonson's family in the future. Theodore Green later recalled that several people at that Thursday evening meeting questioned whether Jonson's plan was too complicated, whether the safer approach was simply to pay the ransom quickly and hope the kidnappers would release Ruthie as promised. Jonson's response was blunt and based on decades of criminal experience. Kidnappers who are competent enough to take my daughter off a Harlem street without witnesses are competent enough to kill her after receiving ransom, Jonson said. Paying money and hopping for the best is gambling with my daughter's life. Finding them, learning everything about them, and then negotiating from a position of knowledge and power gives us the best chance of getting Ruthie back alive. The investigation began immediately Thursday night and continued through Friday with an intensity and comprehensiveness that demonstrated the extent of Jonson's organization and influence throughout Harlem. By Friday morning, Jonson's people had interviewed more than 200 residents, shop owners, and workers who had been on or near 126th Street Thursday evening between 5:30 and 6 o'clock. Most had seen nothing unusual. Several remembered seeing Ruthie walking toward her apartment, which established that she had left her office and had been heading home as expected. 3 witnesses reported seeing a dark blue panel truck parked on 126th Street near the corner of Lenox Avenue at approximately 5:45 Thursday evening. One witness, an elderly woman who had been sitting on her apartment building steps, recalled seeing 2 white men standing near the panel truck, which was unusual because white men rarely appeared in that part of Harlem without obvious business reasons. The witness had not seen the actual abduction, but remembered that the panel truck had driven away quickly heading south on Lenox Avenue at approximately 5:50, which would have been roughly 20 minutes after Ruthie left her office. By Friday afternoon, Jonson's intelligence network had produced additional information. One of the detectives on Jonson's payroll reported that a panel truck matching the description provided by witnesses had been stolen from a commercial garage in the Bronx on Wednesday evening, the day before Ruthie's kidnapping. The theft had been reported to police, but was considered a routine vehicle theft rather than anything connected to a planned kidnapping. More significantly, one of Jonson's informants in the Italian organized crime community reported that a small crew of independent criminals, men not officially affiliated with any major organization, had been discussing plans to kidnap someone important in Harlem, though the informant had not known specific details about target or timeline. The second phone call came at 8:07 Friday evening, almost exactly 24 hours after the first call. Jonson was prepared, sitting at his desk with Theodore Green and William Hewlett present, a tape recorder connected to the telephone line to preserve the conversation, and detailed notes about what questions to ask and what information to demand. The same male voice from Thursday evening spoke without preamble. "We want $750,000 in unmarked bills. Small denominations. You have 48 hours to assemble the money. Sunday evening at 9 o'clock you will receive instructions for delivery. Your daughter remains alive and unharmed. She will remain that way if you follow instructions. If you contact police, if you attempt to find us, if you deviate from our instructions in any way, she dies. Do you understand?" Jonson's response was calculated to accomplish several objectives simultaneously. He needed to appear cooperative to avoid triggering immediate harm to Ruthie. He needed to buy time for his investigation to identify and locate the kidnappers. He needed to establish that Ruthie was alive, because receiving proof of life was standard practice in kidnapping negotiations, and refusing to provide it would suggest the kidnappers had already killed her or were planning to kill her regardless of ransom payment. And he needed to gather information about the kidnappers from their voice, their word choices, their response to questions, anything that might help identify them. Jonson said, "I understand your demands. $750,000 is substantial but can be assembled. Before we proceed, I need proof my daughter is alive and unharmed. I need to speak with her directly." The kidnapper's response was immediate and angry. "You don't make demands, we make demands. You follow instructions or she dies." Jonson remained calm, his voice steady. "I am not making demands. I am requesting reasonable proof before delivering $750,000. Any person conducting a business transaction of this magnitude would require verification. Allow me to speak with my daughter for 30 seconds to confirm she is alive. Then I will follow your instructions exactly as given." There was silence on the line for approximately 15 seconds. Jonson later told associates that during those 15 seconds he was calculating probabilities. If the kidnappers refused to provide proof of life, It likely meant Ruthie was already dead, or that they intended to kill her before ransom exchange regardless. If they agreed to provide proof, it meant they were at least somewhat professional in their approach and were following standard kidnapping protocols that increased the chances they might actually release Ruthie if ransom was paid, though Jonson still did not intend to rely solely on paying ransom and hoping for the best. The kidnapper's voice returned. 30 seconds. Say nothing except that you are unharmed. Any deviation and the call ends. There was a pause, sounds of movement, and then Ruthie's voice came on the line. Daddy, I'm okay. They haven't hurt me. I'm scared, but I'm okay. Jonson responded immediately, keeping his voice calm and steady to avoid increasing her fear. Ruthie, I love you. I am going to bring you home. Stay calm and do everything they tell you. Do not resist or argue. I will handle this. The kidnapper's voice returned. She is alive and unharmed as we promised. You have your proof. Sunday evening 9 o'clock you will receive delivery instructions. Have the money ready. The line went dead. Jonson hung up the telephone and turned to Green and Hewlett. She's alive, Jonson said. They're keeping her somewhere that has some ambient noise in the background. I heard what sounded like traffic, which suggests they're in a building near a road or highway. She sounded frightened but not injured. The kidnappers are following standard protocols, which means they're either experienced or they've studied how professional kidnappings are conducted. We have approximately 46 hours until Sunday evening to find them. Let's use that time effectively. The investigation intensified Friday night and through Saturday. Jonson's organization, working with information from the Italian organized crime informant, had identified a crew of 4 men who operated as independent criminals, taking contracts and conducting operations without affiliation to major crime families. The crew was led by Vincent Marconi, age 36, an experienced criminal with a record including armed robbery, assault, and suspected involvement in 2 previous kidnappings, though he had never been convicted due to lack of evidence. The other 3 crew members were Thomas Sullivan, age 29, Patrick O'Neill, age 32, and Robert Chen, age 27. All 4 men had criminal records. All 4 had worked together on various jobs over the previous 3 years. And most significantly, all 4 had been seen in Harlem during the week before Ruthie's kidnapping, conducting what appeared to be surveillance of Jonson's family, his businesses, and the routes his family members traveled regularly. By Saturday afternoon, Jonson's investigators had identified a warehouse in the South Bronx that Marconi's crew had rented 2 weeks earlier using a false name and front company. The warehouse was located near the Bruckner Expressway, which would explain the traffic noise Jonson had heard during Friday evening's phone call. Surveillance of the warehouse Saturday afternoon confirmed that at least 2 men were present inside the building, and that a dark blue panel truck matching the description from witnesses was parked behind the warehouse. Jonson now had information the kidnappers assumed he did not possess. He knew who they were. He knew where they were holding Ruthie. He knew they planned to maintain their schedule of calling Sunday evening with delivery instructions for ransom exchange. And he knew they almost certainly intended to kill Ruthie after receiving the ransom, because Marconi had a reputation for eliminating witnesses and for never leaving loose ends that could lead back to him. The decision Jonson made Saturday evening, after reviewing all available information with his top associates, shocked everyone who heard it. Rather than attempting an immediate rescue operation, which would be dangerous and could result in Ruthie being killed if the assault on the warehouse went wrong, and rather than simply following the kidnappers' instructions and hoping they would release Ruthie after receiving ransom, Jonson chose a third option that no one had suggested, and that seemed to contradict everything known about how such situations should be handled. Jonson announced he would keep the Sunday evening appointment, would bring the $750,000 in cash as demanded, would follow the kidnappers' delivery instructions exactly, and would allow the exchange to proceed as the kidnappers planned. But Jonson would not go alone to deliver the ransom. He would bring Theodore Green as his attorney and witness. and he would bring a document that would transform the kidnapping from a straightforward criminal transaction into something far more complex and far more dangerous for the kidnappers than they could have imagined. The document Jonson had Theodore Green prepare Saturday evening was a contract, written in formal legal language, signed and notarized. The contract stated that Vincent Marconi, Thomas Sullivan, Patrick O'Neill, and Robert Chen, hereinafter referred to as the contractors, had agreed to provide security services to Ellsworth Johnson, hereinafter referred to as the client, beginning March 18, 1965, and continuing for a period of 10 years. In exchange for these security services, the client agreed to pay contractors $750,000 immediately, and additional payments totaling $50,000 per year for the duration of the 10-year contract. The security services to be provided by contractors included protecting the client's family members from harm, providing intelligence about threats to the client's business interests, and performing such other tasks as the client might require consistent with contractors' skills and experience. The contract was absurd on its face. Vincent Marconi and his crew were not providing security services to Jonson. They had kidnapped his daughter and were demanding ransom, but the contract transformed the entire nature of the transaction in ways that would prove devastating to the kidnappers. If Jonson simply paid ransom and the kidnappers released Ruthie, the transaction was a straightforward criminal exchange. Jonson would have paid money under duress. The kidnappers would have committed felony kidnapping. The kidnappers would then face the question of whether to kill Ruthie to eliminate a witness or to release her, and hope Jonson did not retaliate. But if Jonson paid the $750,000 as the first payment under a contract for security services, and if the kidnappers accepted that characterization by taking the money and signing the contract, then the entire situation changed. The money was no longer ransom payment, but was a legitimate business transaction. Ruthie's release was not the result of kidnapping followed by ransom, but was the contractors fulfilling their obligation to protect the client's family members. And most importantly, the kidnappers would be bound by a 10-year contract that put them in Jonson's employment and under his control, with their signatures on a document that could be used against them if they attempted to renege on their obligations or if they caused any further problems. Theodore Green understood what Jonson was attempting and explained it to the others Saturday evening. Bumpy is weaponizing contract law, Green said. If the kidnappers are stupid enough to sign this contract, and Bumpy thinks they will be because they'll see it as just a formality attached to receiving their money, then they stop being criminals who can disappear after releasing Ruthie and become employees bound by contract terms that Bumpy can enforce through legal means and through other means if necessary. They'll owe him 10 years of service. They'll be required to follow his instructions. And if they violate the contract, Bumpy has legal grounds to pursue them and practical grounds to destroy them. Sunday evening at 9:03, Jonson's telephone rang with the expected call providing delivery instructions. The kidnapper's voice gave precise directions. Jonson was to drive alone to a specific location in Queens, an abandoned factory building, arriving at exactly 10 o'clock. He was to bring the money in a single bag. He was to enter through the front door and place the bag in the center of the main room. He was to leave immediately and return to Harlem. Ruthie would be released unharmed at a location in Harlem within 2 hours of successful money delivery. Jonson listened to the complete instructions and then deviated from them in ways that would determine everything that followed. Jonson said, "I will deliver the money as instructed with 2 modifications. First, my attorney Theodore Green will accompany me as witness to the transaction. Second, I have prepared a contract documenting this exchange as a business transaction rather than a criminal matter. The contract specifies that your crew is providing security services to me and that the $750,000 is payment for those services. This protects both parties. It allows you to possess the money legitimately rather than as proceeds from kidnapping. It protects me by establishing a business relationship that discourages future problems. I will bring the contract with the money. You will sign it. Then you will release my daughter as promised." The kidnapper's voice was immediately hostile. "You don't make changes to our instructions. You follow instructions exactly or your daughter dies." Johnson's response was calm and logical. "The contract benefits you as much as it benefits me. Taking money as payment for services is not kidnapping. Signing a business contract is not a crime. This gives you legal cover for possessing $750,000. Consider it carefully. The only alternative is that you take the money as ransom from a kidnapping, which means you have committed a federal felony, which means I have every incentive to hunt you down afterward regardless of whether you release my daughter. Because letting you escape after committing felony kidnapping against my family makes me appear weak and invites others to try similar actions." There was a long pause. Jonson later told associates he was confident the kidnappers would accept his modification because they would not fully understand its implications. They would see signing a contract as a harmless concession that made receiving the money easier and safer. They would not immediately grasp that signing the contract gave Jonson power over them that would extend far beyond the immediate transaction. The kidnapper's voice returned. "Fine. Bring your attorney. Bring your contract. But if this is some trick, if police are involved, if anything goes wrong, your daughter dies first and then we disappear." "Understood." Jonson said he understood and hung up the telephone. At 9:45 Sunday evening, Jonson and Theodore Green left Harlem in Jonson's personal vehicle, a black Cadillac, carrying a leather bag containing $750,000 in cash and carrying the contract that Green had prepared. They arrived at the abandoned factory in Queens at precisely 10 o'clock. Jonson parked outside the front entrance as instructed. He and Green entered the building carrying the money bag and the contract. Inside the main room, 4 men waited. Vincent Marconi stood in the center with a pistol visible in his waistband. Thomas Sullivan and Patrick O'Neill flanked him, both armed. Robert Chen stood near a door at the rear of the room, also armed. None of the men wore masks. They allowed Jonson and Green to see their faces, which Jonson noted as significant. It confirmed they intended to kill Ruthie after receiving the ransom, because they would not allow witnesses to see their faces if they planned to release those witnesses alive. Marconi spoke first. "Put the money on the floor. Open the bag so we can verify the amount. Then leave. Your daughter will be released in Harlem within 2 hours." Jonson placed the bag on the floor and opened it, revealing stacks of cash in various denominations as demanded. Marconi gestured to O'Neill, who stepped forward and began examining the money, verifying it was genuine currency and counting it to ensure the full amount was present. While O'Neill counted, Jonson spoke in the same calm voice he had used throughout all interactions with the kidnappers. "Before we complete this transaction, there's a business matter to address. Theodore Green is my attorney. He has prepared a contract that documents this exchange. The contract specifies that you and your crew are providing security services to me for a period of 10 years. The $750,000 you're receiving is advance payment for those services. You'll receive an additional $50,000 per year for the duration of the contract. In exchange, you agree to protect my family, provide intelligence about threats to my interests, and perform other security-related tasks as I direct. This is a legitimate business arrangement that allows you to possess this money without it being proceeds from kidnapping. Sign the contract, take the money, release my daughter as promised, and then we'll discuss what security services I'll require from you going forward." Marconi stared at Jonson for several seconds, his expression shifting from confusion to suspicion. "What the hell are you talking about? This isn't a business deal. We kidnapped your daughter. You're paying ransom. There's no contract. There's no ongoing relationship. We take the money, you get your daughter back, and then we never see each other again." Jonson's response was delivered with the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to a slow student. "That's one way this could work," Jonson said. "You take the money as kidnapping ransom. That makes you federal criminals. That means FBI gets involved. That means I spend the next year hunting you down regardless of whether you release my daughter, because I can't allow people who kidnapped my daughter to remain alive and unpunished. Every criminal in New York would see that as weakness and would conclude they could target my family without consequences. So if you take this money as ransom, you're signing your own death warrants. The alternative is you sign this contract, which transforms the transaction into a legitimate business arrangement. You take the money as payment for security services. You release my daughter as the first demonstration that you're fulfilling your contractual obligation to protect my family. And then you work for me for 10 years, which keeps you alive, gives you steady income, and ensures you never create problems for my family again, because doing so would violate your contract and your employment relationship with me. McConney's face flushed red with anger. You're insane. We're not signing anything. We're not working for you. We're taking the money and leaving. Jonson shook his head slowly. If you take the money without signing the contract, you won't make it out of this building alive. Green, show them what's outside. Thudda Green walked to the front door, opened it, and gestured for McConney to look outside. McConney moved to the door cautiously, keeping his weapon drawn, and looked out at the street. What he saw drained the color from his face. Approximately 40 men surrounded the building. Some were positioned across the street. Others stood near vehicles parked at strategic locations. All were visibly armed. All were watching the building entrance. McConney turned back to Jonson, his voice tight with fear and rage. You said no police. You said come alone. Jonson smiled slightly. I said I wouldn't contact police. I didn't. Those men outside are not police. They're my associates. I said my attorney would accompany me. I did not say I would come without backup in case negotiations went poorly. Here's your situation. You can sign the contract, take the money as legitimate payment for services, release my daughter, and begin a 10-year employment relationship that keeps you alive and pays you well. Or you can refuse to sign, in which case my men outside will storm this building, there will be a gunfight, and you will all die here tonight. Your choice. Make it quickly, because we're operating on a schedule and I want my daughter released within the hour. McConney looked at his 3 crew members. All appeared terrified. They had planned a straightforward kidnapping and ransom exchange. They had expected to take the money, kill the witness, and disappear. Instead, they were trapped in a building surrounded by overwhelming force, being offered a choice between signing a contract or dying. O'Null spoke quietly to McConney. Maybe we should sign it. Get out of here alive. Figure out the rest later. McConney hesitated, clearly trying to identify some angle that would allow them to take the money and escape without signing the contract or dying in the building. But Jonson had structured the situation perfectly. Every option except signing the contract led to death or capture. Finally, McConney spoke, his voice bitter with defeat. Where's the contract? Thudda Green produced the document, placed it on a crate that served as makeshift table, and handed McConney a pen. Green pointed to signature lines for all 4 crew members. All of you need to sign, Green said. This is a contract binding all 4 of you to 10 years of service. Once you sign, the money is yours to take immediately. You release Miss Johnson unharmed in Harlem within 1 hour as specified in the agreement. Then tomorrow morning, you report to Mr. Johnson's office to receive your first assignment under the contract terms. Sign here. McConney signed. Sullivan signed. O'Null signed. Chun signed. All 4 men signed the contract that bound them to 10 years of service to the man whose daughter they had kidnapped. Thudda Green witnessed the signatures, added his own signature as notary, and placed the contract in his briefcase. Now release my daughter, Jonson said. Tell me where she is. McConney's voice was flat, defeated. Warehouse on Bruckner Expressway, South Bronx. She's locked in an office on the 2nd floor, unharmed. Keys are in my jacket pocket. Jonson gestured to William Hewlett, who had been waiting outside and who entered the building at Johnson's signal. Hewlett took the keys from McConney. Jonson gave him the warehouse address, and Hewlett left immediately with 4 other men to retrieve Ruthie. Jonson turned back to McConney and his crew. Take your money and leave. Report to my office at 9 tomorrow morning. We'll discuss what security services I'll be requiring from you. And understand this clearly. You signed a contract. You're bound by its terms. If you violate any provision of that contract, if you fail to perform services as directed, if you attempt to harm my family or my business interests, I will use every legal and extra-legal means available to destroy you. You made a terrible mistake kidnapping my daughter. The contract you just signed is your only chance to survive that mistake. Use it wisely. The 4 kidnappers took the money bag and left the building, walking past Johnson's 40 men stationed outside, getting into a vehicle and driving away into the Queen's night. Jonson and Green stood in the empty factory room for a moment. Green spoke first. They'll try to run. They'll take the money and disappear rather than report tomorrow morning. Jonson nodded. I expect they'll try. That's why I had Rumund Bird photograph all 4 of them as they were leaving. And that's why the contract includes their signatures and addresses and identification information. If they run, we hunt them. If they stay and fulfill the contract, they live. Either way, the problem is resolved. Rutha was found exactly where McCunney said she would be, locked in an office at the warehouse in the South Bronx. She was frightened and exhausted but physically unharmed. Hillett and his team brought her back to Harlem by 11:30 Sunday evening. Jonson was waiting at his residence when she arrived. The reunion was emotional but brief. Jonson held his daughter, confirmed she had not been injured or mistreated beyond being held captive, and then sent her to stay with relatives outside New York City for 2 weeks while he dealt with the aftermath of the kidnapping. Monday morning at 9 o'clock, Vincent McCunney appeared at Johnson's office above the Palm Cafe. He came alone. He explained that Sullivan, O'Neill, and Chun had fled New York Sunday night immediately after taking the ransom money. They had divided the $750,000 4 ways and had left for different cities, intending to disappear and start new lives far from Johnson's reach. McCunney claimed he had decided to honor the contract because he understood Jonson would hunt them all down eventually, and because working for Jonson for 10 years was better than spending the rest of his life running. Jonson listened to McCunney's explanation and then gave him his first assignment under the contract terms. Find Sullivan, O'Neill, and Chun, Jonson said. Bring them back to New York. Convince them that honoring the contract is their only chance of survival. You have 2 weeks. If you can't bring them back, give me their locations and I'll have them brought back by other means. McCunney left to begin his assignment. Over the next 6 weeks, all 3 missing kidnappers were located and returned to New York. Sullivan was found in Chicago, O'Neill in Miami, Chun in Los Angeles. All 3 were convinced, through methods that were never fully detailed, but that apparently involved both persuasion and threats, to return to New York and honor the contract they had signed. For the next 10 years, from 1965 until 1975, Vincent McCunney and his crew worked for Bumpy Johnson under the terms of the contract signed in that Queens factory building. They provided security services, protected Johnson's family, gathered intelligence about threats to Johnson's interests, and performed various other tasks as directed. They were paid $50,000 per year collectively as specified in the contract. They were never trusted, but they were used effectively. Jonson later explained to Thudda Green why he had structured the kidnapping response the way he did, rather than simply killing the kidnappers or paying ransom and hopping for the best. Green recounted the explanation in his memoirs published in 1987. Bumpy told me that killing the kidnappers would be satisfying but wasteful, Green wrote. They were competent criminals who had successfully taken his daughter off a Harlem street without witnesses. That demonstrated skills that could be valuable if those skills could be redirected toward serving Jonson rather than threatening him. By forcing them to sign a contract and then holding them to that contract for 10 years, Jonson accomplished several objectives simultaneously. He got his daughter back safely. He transformed dangerous enemies into controlled employees. He sent a message to every other criminal in New York that attacking Johnson's family was not merely dangerous, but was likely to result in the attackers becoming Johnson's servants for years to come. And he demonstrated strategic thinking that reinforced his reputation as someone who should not be challenged. because he would find creative and devastating ways to respond that went beyond simple retaliation. What shocked New York was not that Jonson got his daughter back. That was expected. What shocked everyone was that he got his daughter back while simultaneously converting the kidnappers into long-term employees, bound by legal contract to serve the man they had wronged. It was brilliant and terrifying and completely unexpected. The story of Ruthie Johnson's kidnapping and Bumpy Johnson's response spread through New York's criminal underworld rapidly and influenced how other criminals thought about targeting powerful figures' families for years afterward. The lesson was clear. Kidnapping family members might result not merely in death, but in something worse than death, permanent servitude to the person you had wronged, bound by legal contract that could be enforced through courts if necessary, and through violence if legal enforcement proved insufficient. Between 1965 and Bumpy Johnson's death in 1968, no one attempted to kidnap or harm his family members. The deterrent effect was absolute. What Vincent McConney learned during his 10 years working for Jonson, from 1965 until McConney's death from cancer in 1975, was that Jonson had known from the moment he received the first ransom call Thursday evening that the kidnappers would not simply release Ruthie after receiving payment. Jonson had understood that competent criminals eliminate witnesses. Jonson had calculated that his best chance of getting Ruthie back alive was not to pay ransom and hope, but to identify the kidnappers, surround them with overwhelming force, and then offer them a choice between death and servitude. The contract was the key element that made servitude preferable to death, because it gave the kidnappers legal status as Jonson's employees rather than leaving them as criminals who had committed felony kidnapping, and who would face life imprisonment or death penalty if caught. McConney told this to Thada Green shortly before McConney died in 1975. "Bumpy saved our lives by making us sign that contract," McConney said. "We thought we were being clever, taking the rich gangster's daughter and demanding ransom. We thought we'd get paid and disappear. We didn't understand we were dealing with someone who thought 10 steps ahead of everyone else. He turned us from kidnappers into security contractors with one signature. He gave us legitimate employment that kept us alive and kept us useful. And he made sure we understood that violating the contract would be worse than any punishment law enforcement could deliver. I served those 10 years because I was smart enough to realize Jonson had given me a gift, the gift of staying alive when I should have died for what I did." Ruthie Johnson lived for another 40 years after the kidnapping, dying peacefully in 2005 at age 69. She rarely spoke about the kidnapping experience, but in a single interview given to a Harlem newspaper in 1998, she addressed what her father had done to get her back. "My father saved my life using intelligence rather than violence," Ruthie said. "He could have attacked the warehouse where I was being held. That might have got me killed in the crossfire. He could have paid the ransom and hoped they'd release me. That almost certainly would have got me killed because the kidnappers knew I could identify them. Instead, my father found a third option that no one else would have thought of. He transformed criminals into contractors. He turned a crime into a business transaction. He saved my life, and he ensured those men would never threaten our family again. That was typical of how my father operated. He was a criminal, yes, but he was also the smartest strategic thinker I ever knew." What happened in March 1965 demonstrated that better than anything else in his life. The contract that Vincent McConney and his crew signed in that Queens factory building Sunday night, March 21, 1965, remained in effect until 1975 when the 10-year term expired. By that time, Bumpy Johnson had been dead for 7 years, but his estate continued paying the annual $50,000 to the 3 surviving contractors, Sullivan, O'Neill, and Chun, McConney having died from cancer. The estate also continued requiring services from the contractors under the contract terms until the contract's natural expiration. Thada Green managed the estate and enforced the contract. In 1975, when the contract term ended, Green held a final meeting with the 3 surviving kidnappers. Green told them they were released from their obligations, that they were free to leave New York or to retire or to pursue whatever lives they chose. He also told them that Bumpy Johnson had left specific instructions in his will about what should be done when the contract expired. Each of the 3 surviving contractors received a final payment of $100,000 as completion bonus for fulfilling their 10-year obligation. The payment was unexpected and generous, and came with a message from Jonson written before his death in 1968. The message read, "To the men who kidnapped my daughter in 1965 and who served the contracted period faithfully afterward, you made a terrible mistake, but you paid for it with 10 years of service. This payment marks the end of your obligation and my acknowledgement that you fulfilled the contract terms. You are free men now. Use your freedom wisely. Remember what happened when you made the mistake of threatening what I valued. Remember that intelligence defeats violence. Remember that contracts bind even criminals when properly structured and properly enforced. And remember that second chances are rare. Don't waste this one." The message was signed by Bumpy Johnson and dated June 1968, 1 month before his death. Sullivan, O'Neill, and Chun all left New York after receiving their completion bonuses and their release from contract obligations. Sullivan moved to Arizona and opened a small construction company that operated successfully for 20 years. O'Neill moved to Ireland, where he had family connections, and lived quietly until his death in 1992. Chun moved to California, where he worked in restaurant management, and died in 2003. None of the 3 ever committed serious crimes again. All 3 told people in their later years that serving Bumpy Johnson under forced contract was the best thing that ever happened to them because it saved their lives and taught them that intelligence and strategy defeated violence and impulsiveness. What shocked New York in March 1965 was not that a powerful criminal got his daughter back after she was kidnapped. That happened occasionally. What shocked everyone was how Jonson accomplished it. No violence beyond the implicit threat that made signing the contract preferable to dying. No ransom paid without receiving something valuable in return. No criminals escaping unpunished. Instead, a legal contract that transformed kidnappers into employees, a strategic response that demonstrated intelligence rather than rage, and a resolution that left everyone involved better off than they would have been if Jonson had responded with traditional retaliation. The kidnapping and Jonson's response influenced how criminals throughout New York thought about conflict resolution and retaliation for years afterward. The lesson was clear. Bumpy Johnson doesn't just win conflicts, he transforms them into opportunities. He doesn't just punish enemies, he converts them into assets. And he doesn't just react to threats. He restructures situations so thoroughly that the people who threatened him end up serving him. That was the shock. That was the lesson. That was why the story of Ruthie Johnson's kidnapping became legendary, and why it remained relevant decades after both Jonson and the kidnappers had died.